I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the introduction, but the whole chapter, 1 Timothy chapter 5, the whole chapter is about the discipline in the church. Particularly today, it's going to be regarding the role of the pastor and the discipline that, spiritual disciplines that should be seen in his life, the church's obligation to the pastor and the pastor's obligation to the church, and particularly, as you can see in the title, the elder pastor and the younger pastor. And I think I can assume the title of elder at this point in life. But let me walk you through that. You have the notes there. And so the first part begins with spiritual discipline in the church. And so there were two things we looked at. The first was the treatment of men in the church. And particularly there's two men that are found, or nouns that describe the men that are found in verse 1. What are they? Two men. The elder man and the younger man. So we have how they ought to be addressed, how the elder ought to be addressed, and treat him as a father. The younger man, treat him as a brother. And then we come to the treatment of women in the church. And again, in verse 2, you have two classes of women, right? You have the elder women, to be treated as mothers. You have the younger sisters to be treated with all purity, and that means that the relationship of the pastor in particular with the younger women should be as sisters and valuing their purity. And then two classes of widows in the church. There are the widows indeed, and then there are the widows that have children or nephew. Somebody give me a quick definition. What's a widow indeed? Right. A widow who really has no one to turn to. Whatever needs arise in her life, she will be looking as a member to the church to meet those needs. Now, if a widow has children or grandchildren or extended family, she should look where first for help? She should look to the children and the grandchildren. In here it says the nephews, but essentially it's grandchildren. And so, and again, we're going to look at this tonight through the spectacles of deacons. So that's what I want to look at tonight. And we have several of the deacons in here. So a widow comes to the church, and she's a member of the church, and she comes and she says, I have a need. The first question that the deacons should ask is what? All right, do you have any children? Why is that important? Because the children are on the front row of obligation. They have an obligation to the mother and to the grandmother. So that's one of the first questions. Now, is the church obligated to all widows in the church and outside the church? No, we're not. Our first obligation is going to be to widows within the church itself. Now, there can be times that we assist widows outside the church, but the first obligation that the church has will be to the widows in the church. And I can remember early on in my ministry when needs like this would arise, there was a hesitancy of the men in those early years to ask the hard questions. And so there's some of the deacons in here. What are some of the hard questions that you have to ask when someone comes, like a widow comes, and she says, I have a need? What are some of the hard questions? Help me out, deacons. Come on. Or any of you men that have served. Go ahead.
Well, do you have family nearby? And I know that, even my family, that was an issue where they had family nearby and were not taking care of them.
Right.
And that's something that needs to be addressed as well.
Right, and we did that. You guys have unfortunately been out for the last 3 weeks, but we did talk about the fact that sometimes families abandon their loved ones, and there again, now the church has to step in and address the need that is there. And then there's other things too. It's not just what can the church do for them, but it's also do they have a budget? Another good question is, what are your savings? Where are your savings? Sometimes you find, unfortunately, that family has tapped into their savings. And I shared with you about showing up at a widow's house and all of her heirlooms. Silver was gone, and they soon found out that the car was gone, the house had been changed over into a different name. I mean, and so I stepped in a hard way with that, with a niece and a nephew that lived somewhere else. And I just said, you need to get down here because you have an obligation to take care of this. And they did. They were on like the next plane coming in. But there's things you have to step into and make it your business. When people come and ask for help, it is your business then, right? What's, yeah.
So it occurs to me that there are many opportunities one-on-one that we might see to care for someone.
Oh, absolutely.
You're pointing out that there is also the relationship that we have with the leaders of our church, with our deacons and you.
Sure.
That there would be times when we need to exercise the wisdom of calling on you, and you're the next dog to come into the fight.
Right. Well, and fortunately, I'm blessed. The deacons handle now a lot of this without me stepping into it. Eventually, it comes to me if it needs to. But there are sometimes things that are appropriately addressed by the pastor because there's things that I know that maybe no one else is aware of. And then there's sometimes widows that have been here, haven't been able to be here in 10 years because they're shut-ins, and I know them better than maybe anyone else does. Let me go on to the next thought. The older widow indeed, I don't want to spend much time on it. The widow indeed, again, and it describes this widow, going along the line of what Sean was saying, she's desolate. So it may not be that she doesn't have children or grandchildren, but it means she's been forsaken. And then there are qualifications of the widows. So it's not just a widow in the church, but it's what is the testimony of this widow in the church. And I can think of instances where they were just wonderful, godly women. And then I can think of instances where they weren't so wonderful and godly women. And so even as the church steps into this, the question will be addressed, what is the testimony of this lady? And you can see in this passage here in verse 5, is she one that has evidenced faith in God? She's one that has continued in supplications and prayers. So there is a piety, a genuine piety about that woman. And so, you hope and you pray that as we all grow older, we become more spiritually minded, godly, but that may not always be the case. So there's another whole realm of addressing the testimony of the widows indeed. And then it continues her legacy. She that liveth in pleasure is dead while she liveth, and these things give in charge that they may be blameless. And so you still have the ongoing ministry. The ministry of the church is not to make the widows and the widows comfortable. It's to encourage them. And I think sometimes we might hesitate engaging with older people, which some of us be there, but we ought always to be engaged to be spiritually growing and maturing, right? So you can be a 40-year-old fool, or you can be a 90-year-old fool. Foolishness is not doesn't have fences around age group. Chronologically, you can be a fool no matter what age you are. All right, moving on. 1 Timothy 5, verse 8, believers care and support for the widows indeed. And so this goes through the expectation that if somebody is in the church and they appear to be spiritually minded, but they're neglecting their parents, or they're neglecting their grandparents, well, then that's a problem, right? Because it casts a shadow over their life. And in this particular instance, they're worse than an infidel if they neglect their family. Worse than an infidel. And feel free to raise your hand and jump in with comments as I go through this if you want. The churches, and by the way, I'm going fast through this because we've studied it, and some of the rest of you can look at it again at another time. Okay, at what age is the church obligated to a widow? Verse 9. What age is that? 60 years and younger. We're not obligated. Now, there can be obligations, but 60 years and older. So 60 years was that mark there. And again, look at verse 10, the whole testimony of the widow again. And so for us that are gray-head and we're growing older, let's be mindful of what our testimony is, because it is important as we grow older. Then the younger widows. Now, the younger widows refuse. For when they begun to wax wanton against Christ, they will marry. Now, what should the church do regarding younger widows? Do you remember? We ought to encourage them to get married. Now, I don't know how that would go over Sunday morning, but that is it. A younger widow who remarries. Now, let's talk about this wax wanton. In her grief and her sorrow, she's a widow. And she just pours her life into the Lord and into His Word and into church, and it just becomes her life. And so in this setting, she dedicates her life to Christ. And I'm not going to be turned aside by the cares of this world or by another man. So I'm just going to be wholly dedicated to Christ. And Paul writes, says, no, wait a minute. There may be a time right now they have this spiritual piety and wholly dedicated to the Lord, but there might be a time later they're going to wish they could marry. And so he says, be careful about this matter of dedicating yourself. And then younger widows can get into trouble, right? 1 Timothy 5, verse 12, having damnation because they have cast off their first faith. Now that's bearing the guilt of, I dedicated myself wholly to Christ. I'm committed to be a widow who loves and serves the Lord. And then somebody comes along and they say, well, maybe I want to have a second thought on that dedication. And so that's why Paul just says, hey, don't jump into wholly committing yourself to being a widow the rest of your life, because God may bring along your path someone that will be a lifetime mate for you. Verse 13, with all the younger widows, they learn to be idle. They wander from house to house, not only idle, tattlers, busybodies, speaking things which they ought not, posting things on Facebook, and, you could go on and on, that the things that we have today that you could get in trouble with. And so that's with the younger widow. Now, 14 and 15, young widows should be encouraged to remarry. I will, therefore, writes Paul, that the younger women marry, bear children. This is all within that context of the younger widow. Bear children, guide the house, give not occasion to the adversary to speak reproachfully, for some are already turned aside after Satan. So why should a younger woman get married? She should, because it'll keep her busy. In good things. Is there a higher calling than bearing children or guiding and overseeing the house? So anyway, I don't know that I've ever heard this preached, but I mean, it is there and it is practical. Anybody comment before I move on? All right, moving on. Verse 16 then. Believers were expected to care for widows in their family. And that verse, of course, if any man or woman that believeth have widows, let them relieve them, let them assist them. Let not the church be charged. So that's why if someone comes to the church and they say, I have a need, the first question we ought to be asking is, do you have any family? I think I shared with you when I was in Newbern, North Carolina, visiting my mother-in-law, and I had this gentleman come up, and he really was dressed the part. He looked like a bum on the street, except he was wearing Air Jordans. And I'm thinking, so I'm watching him. I'm finding this guy intriguing. So he comes, sits down beside me, and he starts talking about how poor he is. He's down and out and doesn't have any money. And of course, I pointed out, but you're wearing Air Jordans. Well, those were given to me. I said, they're Air Jordans. And so he wanted help. And I said, I'll tell you what, do you have any family around here? And he said, I do. I said, who do you have? Well, my mom lives in the next little town. I said, I tell you what, I will help you out if you'll give me your mother's phone number, and I'm going to call her, and I'm going to tell her you're begging in Newbern, North Carolina for help. And of course, he wouldn't give me the phone number, right? He said, no, not going to happen, not going to do it. And he got angry and got up and walked away. But my response was the right response. I'm willing to help you, but I'm more than willing to call your mom and say, you're begging on the street in North Carolina. And by the way, you're wearing Air Jordan. So anyway, with the church, that happens a lot too. People come and they ask for help. And shall I share the one thing we just did recently? I share it. A gentleman came back a couple of times wanting help. And so I think I told the deacons, the next time he comes wanting help, tell him Pastor Dan needs to go and visit him at his home before we'll help him again. And he hasn't been back because they didn't want anyone to go to his house. And he said, well, I don't want my stepson to know what I'm doing. Well, yeah, you're milking the church. That's what you're doing. Steve.
I've seen it over years of ministry that a lot of times the kids, like if you try to help the widow or that she ends up just giving the money to her kids who are wayward and letting them blow the money and that she's still destitute.
Yeah. Sadly, there have been, even here over the years, times where kids basically just took everything they had, I think I shared with you once visiting a widow after the death of her husband, and Sheila and I actually went to the house and visited, and I'm expecting to meet all the family, right? The children, and, the children were gone. I said, well, where are the sons? Well, they wanted my safe deposit key, so they've gone to the bank I said, why did you do that? And she said, well, they asked for it. Well, she ended up being destitute. She ended up at Rocky Creek. Any of you know where that is? It's down off of Waters Avenue. And I remember the last time I visited her room was like an ice box. It was just like the lowest end of the nursing home you could be in. It was just really, really bad. So, let's go to the next one here. You recognize this young guy, right? Ya'avi. And we ordained him in 2019, I believe it was. So if you would, for your outline, let's work through this. So the honors, role, and ordination of elders and pastors. So let's read this. You have your outline in the PowerPoint there. So let's go through it. Verse 17. Let the elders that rule well be counted worthy of double honor, especially they who labor in the word and doctrine. So what is this verse about? Going on, verse 18. For the scripture saith, thou shalt not muzzle the ox that treadeth out the corn, and the laborer is worthy of his reward. So what is verse 17 and 18? What is it about? Huh? Pay. It's about compensation. Really, it's about two things. The first is rule well, be counted worthy of what? Double honor. So the first thing is honor. And the second thing, as you go to verse 18, deals with compensation. So there's two thoughts there. Churches should honor. By the way, I don't have an axe to grind tonight, but this is just where we are. All right, churches should honor and fairly compensate pastors for their labor. That's the essence of verse 17 and verse 18. So I'm going to go to verse 17 and walk this through a little bit. So as you look at verse 17, and let's say you are a deacon board and you are evaluating a pastor, or you're looking at calling a pastor, okay? Don't get any ideas. Verse 17 then. There's some qualifying phrases in verse 17 that are essential. They're very important. All right, so the first is elder. So we're dealing with not just the office of the pastor, but arguably a mature spiritual leader. Okay, so moving on from that. The first qualifying phrase is what? Rule well. Now, the idea of ruling well, and I think I have it, a little bit of it on your outline here, is to preside over, to manage the spiritual interests of the church. Another word would be administration, okay? So, to rule well. So, when you're looking at a pastor, the question should be, before you get to how much are we going to pay him or whatever, does he rule well? So that's the first quality that you have there. In fact, it's funny, I was at a board meeting and we were chatting, and I was talking to a younger pastor, and another pastor engaged in the conversation, and he said, what's the qualification of the pastor in 1 Timothy 5? And I looked at him, I said, rule well. And he said, absolutely. And so that is the standard. And maybe some of you have been in churches where there wasn't a rule well standard that was there, and a total disaster can follow upon that for the church itself. Then the second thing is, should a pastor rule well, he is to be. Now, two things then that you find in this passage is, one, he is to be honored. And the idea of honor, I wrote in my notes here, to be treated with respect and esteemed. It doesn't mean he's on a pedestal, but that you do honor the office. And I would say to you, in a church, if a church has a pastor and you say, well, I can't honor him, I can't esteem him, or you need to go to another church then, because invariably that church is going to be in trouble. It's going to have problems in its leadership. Here's a verse, 1 Thessalonians 5, verse 13, and to esteem them very highly in love for their work's sake. So the idea, again, is to appreciate the labor. Agree? Appreciate the work that goes into the work of the ministry. Now, I'm going to go on to the next one. This is verse 18. Now, verse 18 then deals with fairly compensated. You're familiar with 1 Timothy 5, verse 18. And on your outline, let's just go through it for a minute. This is taken from the Old Testament. In fact, you can see on the outline in the verse there, Deuteronomy chapter 25 and verse 4 is the law regarding the ox. So Paul pulls from that law, makes the application to the pastor. Let me read it. 1 Timothy 5:18. For the scripture saith, thou shalt not muzzle the ox that treadeth out the corn. And now, when I was younger, I used to hear of churches that didn't like their pastor. And so the attitude was, well, we're just going to starve him out. You know what that means, right? We're going to keep him so poor that invariably he has to leave, or he's got to get a secular job. And so that's an attitude that is out there in some churches. For those of you that have been a part of Hillsdale for years and years and years, you really don't have a clue of what goes on in some of the other churches, especially some of the small churches. It's just incredible. Board-run churches are an absolute disgrace and a nightmare, because they ultimately will control the spirit of the ministry, and they'll starve the pastor out if they decide to. Let me move on with this here then. Verse 18, for the scripture saith, thou shalt not muzzle, and that is, stop the mouth of the ox that treadeth out the corn, and the laborer is worthy of his reward. So worthy, you can see, is deserving of his reward being his labor. Here's a thought then that goes with that. Pastors who diligently labor in the word and doctrine are especially worthy of double honor. There are pastors I've known, they're out golfing and they're out fishing, and they've got all of these things that they do, and none of those are wrong, right? But they do have their place, and even the things that we do ought to be done in moderation. And I don't want to say any more. Comments? Anybody? Yeah, Steve?
There's, and I was at a church one time that their interpretation of this is that the pastor should make double what everyone else makes. Is that
Should make double what everyone else makes? I haven't heard that, but we'll take that under advisement. Are you serious? Oh, that is foolish.
The pastor interpreted it that way, and, so all of the staff makes this, and the pastor has to make double.
Everybody around him's kept poor.
Yeah.
Taj Mahal?
Well, I can appreciate, the work that you do, especially here at the church and online, because I just started following your
Yeah.
study online,
Yeah.
studying a lot. I know you labor in the Word. And,
My wife will tell you she hardly sees me.
so, I mean, it is. It's something
Yeah.
that you have to look into.
Well, I'm blessed at this for the first time in my ministry years. I can actually be almost wholly devoted to studying and preparing and writing, and but that is because I have good staff around me, including Steve. I mean, you realize when Steve Armstrong came, I was doing all the preaching and I was doing the choir. So I had choir practice Sunday mornings. I had choir practice all Wednesdays and Sunday nights. Yeah, I was wearing myself out, to say the least. I look back over the last years, and my wife will sometimes comment, said, "I don't know how you did it, how you got through all that." But I was so determined that I wasn't going to allow the music at this church to go the wrong way. And I was blessed to have enough talent, not like this man, but I was blessed to have enough talent to keep it going. And I don't know what it is about this generation, but they feel like they have a right to take a church and take it any way they want to. And that's one of the reasons I'm kind of drilling down on this some, is that not only the deacons, but the church body itself has got to know what the Bible says. And you don't waver from that. And anyway, a lot more could be said. Sean?
Just an interesting side note, we had a visitor from USF on Sunday, and they specifically mentioned how amazing our music was, and we're mentioning how amazing Grace Ann
Yeah, absolutely.
was. And it sounded like you'd never seen anything like this before.
Sure. Yeah. I had several comment on the way out that were visiting, and they said, "Wow, this is the way we used to hear music," and said, "Our church has gone to bands, so they've gone to this and gone to that." And, some of you know, I had to take a stand, about 12 years ago to just say, we're not going that way. And I can remember saying, I either want your resignation or I want your subordination, but I'm not going to continue down this path. And of course it hurt the church, because by the time I realized it, we lost 70 people that were drawn away by that. And I think all 70 of them have gone other places now, sadly. But anyway, that's another story. But it's a story that I should tell because it's part of what we're going to find here in the scriptures in a moment. Now, let's go on to verse 19 and verse 20. And 1 Timothy 5, verse 19 and 20. Against an elder receive not an accusation, but before 2 or 3 witnesses. Them that sin rebuke before all, that others also may fear. Now, a point with this, in verse 19, well, we saw in the prior 2 verses, the honor deserving of the pastor in his office. Then we come to verse 19, and we see the protection that ought to be afforded to the elder. And then verse 20, we see the double-edged sword. So on one side, protect the testimony of the pastor, but on the other side is, if he sins, rebuke him before all. And so you have, with great honor, also is great consequences of failing to abide in the quality or the traits of a good elder. So here's a thought then. Churches should, based on verse 19, should protect their pastors and exercise caution when a pastor is accused of wrongdoing. Now, today, you can be accused of wrongdoing in a blog. You can be accused of wrongdoing in an email. You can be accused of wrongdoing in a text. People will hit all those other places before they'll come in and face the deacons. And that's happened. It's happened in recent years. Won't face the deacons, but they'll do something in church if you give them a platform. So I'm hoping in this lesson here, I'm going to stop that ever happening again, whether it's me or anybody that follows after me. So let's look at verse 19 then. Against an elder, receive not an accusation. I can't tell you how many times over the years I've had to go to lunch with a church member that had listened to an accusation. They should have dismissed the accusation. But instead, I'm the one now that's having to answer for them listening to an accusation. Do you understand that? We live in a day in which the idea of innocence is no longer presumed. If there's an accusation, it's presumed that you must be wrong. And the one making the accusation must be right. But in effect, unless there's 2 or 3 testimonies, quality testimonies, you should never entertain an accusation against a pastor or any other pastor. You should never, ever. Yeah.
Logistically on that, how would you put together 2 or 3 witnesses?
Okay, it would.
Without them talking to each other or talking to somebody else?
It would be the Matthew chapter 18. Okay, so in Matthew chapter 18, you go to your brother, and if he will not hear you, then you take 2 or 3 witnesses.
So this is talking about witnesses of the accusation, not witnesses of the wrongdoing?
Right,
Okay.
right. And so those 2 or 3 witnesses go with this person, and then they make their accusation against the pastor. The 2 or 3 witnesses hear the accusation, but they also hear the response to the accusation. That's the path. On your outline, look at it for a moment. Against an elder, receive not. I got elders, I apologize. Against an elder, receive not an accusation. Don't embrace, don't assent to, don't welcome. In other words, it essentially says don't listen to it. And if you listen to it, you're wrong. Because you should have had 2 or 3 witnesses.
So what you do, you say, well, I hear what you're saying. Now you need to go back and get those others that you think are out there saying the same thing. And you as
Well, but then that already implies that you're already guilty of spreading gossip and rumors at that point.
So really, when someone starts, you take them to the party.
Right. When they start, you stop it. Then you can say, we'll go and talk to the pastor. They will not go and talk to the pastor.
That's what I was going to say. I took on a policy many years ago. It didn't have to be the pastor or anyone in the church. If they made an accusation or someone after, well, let's go talk to them.
Right.
And that usually puts a stop to it.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, that's,
But you have to do that. You have to do that. Here's the reason why. If you don't protect the pastor's testimony, put me aside, talk about any of them, but if you don't protect their testimony, then you have failed to protect the church. Now, it doesn't mean that the pastor doesn't make errors, make mistakes, even sin. But what we're talking about is a pattern of sin that is unrepented of. Let me go ahead.
I was going to say, I think by the time someone goes to say something to someone else, they've already been stewing over it. They've rehearsed it in their mind 100 times, and they've come up with the most convincing way to explain their beef to somebody.
Oh yeah, sure.
So it's all the more persuasive. So if you take the chance to listen to it, there's that better chance you're going, I don't know, that makes a lot of sense or whatever.
Oh yeah. Let me give you some thoughts that go with this on your outline. First of all, we understand that accusations against spiritual leaders are a favored tactic of Satan. We could go back with Joseph and the accusations that were brought against Joseph. We could go with Moses and the murmuring and the accusations that were brought against Moses. You can just go through the scriptures again and again and again. You can deal with John the Apostle and Diotrephes. He's done me much harm. Or we could deal with Paul, and he's identified 2 that were trouble in the church at Ephesus where Timothy is preaching. And so these are not just speculative. These are very real things that he knew that Timothy would face. Here's another. Spiritual leaders are not perfect. And like all believers, they have flaws. And I understand that. My wife will be the first to agree with you. However, they are easy targets for gossip, criticism, and lies. I mean, you know, what I had happened a few years ago, somebody is writing and they're blogging. Now, I mean, does anyone here think that that was the right way to deal with a disagreement? Is there anyone that thinks that? Then why did some of us at this church give them the time of day? Because in effect, what you did was wrong me. Because you entertained something else. Now, I said this in church a while back, so I'm not going to belabor it. But when I retire here, ultimately, one day, my greatest hurt I will leave here with will be the times of disloyalty, because there have been too many over the years. That's just a reality. And it's something you don't forget. You're not bitter. I'm not bitter. But you learn. Yes, Steve?
So if you were telling the exact process, like if you wrong somebody in the church, can you walk that through? Like, so if you wronged me, and I came to you and said, hey, you wronged me, and you're like, I don't want to hear it.
Sure.
Well, what would, and this is not, I'm not asking. Hey, I got this.
Speak louder.
But a lot of times we don't tell people like the proper process. And
Right.
It's so if.
That's why this is up here.
Yeah, at that point, do I go to two other people and say, hey, I have an accusation to bring against the pastor, can you come with me? Is that what happens, or?
It would be that you would come and you would say, to two or three, I need you to go with me to talk to pastor.
Not tell them what it's all about.
Right.
You were to say, I have something.
Right. That's why Matthew 18:15 through 17 is whether it's dealing with the pastor or dealing with the church member, it's still very practical. It's the practice that you should follow in the process of that. So the pastors make errors. You can lose your temper. There's some things you can do that you highly regret. There are some things you can do that you should be out of the ministry, and we're going to look at those in a moment. All right. 1 Timothy 5:20. Then the sin rebuke before all, that others may also fear. So let's talk about this, because it somewhat goes along with what Steve was saying there. So, yeah.
Just, in that verse, it says to take
Which verse?
Matthew 18,
18:15 through 17.
16. It said that in thy mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, every word may be established. So what they're doing is giving context so that those are the witnesses aren't bringing the charge. They're listening to the dialogue
context.
so they can verify what
That
was
is true.
said
Right,
and what's
right.
correct.
Right. Exactly. Right. And the point is this, is that the pastor deserves the same process. But here's what people will do. They'll say, well, I'm intimidated by the pastor. I just, I don't feel comfortable going to the pastor. It doesn't matter what you feel, and it doesn't matter how comfortable you are. If what you're bringing is an offense, then you have to walk it out, Matthew 18:15 through 17. But a lot of people will say, well, I'm uncomfortable, or I'm intimidated. Huh?
If you're like that, don't say anything. That's right.
Well, true.
Well, a lot of people get through that first step. I've seen this before, where somebody will go to the pastor and the pastor reacts wrong,
Yeah.
and then they're like, I'm out, and they just leave. So
Which is wrong.
Those things never get addressed, because it's easier just to go find a different.
Right, so that's where you come to verse 20. Here's the other side of the sword. In verse 20, them that sin rebuke before all, that others also may fear. Now, I hear a lot of believers use this out of context. But the context of 1 Timothy 5, verse 20, is actually rebuke the pastor. So you go with one-on-one, and then you took 2 or 3 others. Now, preferably, if it's the pastor, you probably should take the deacons, or 2 or 3 deacons there. But it doesn't necessarily have to be, because I understand sometimes you can be in a church where the deacons don't think. And so the pastor runs it all, and they just kind of, I mean, here deacons are engaged in everything. They have 3 committees, and they're involved in all the aspects of church discipline, of finances. So they're very much a part of the ministry. But let's go back to verse 20, which kind of deals with what Steve was talking about. If the pastor has sinned and he continues in that sin. Now, I'm not talking about a moral sin that he's out of the ministry, but I'm talking about a pattern of sin that is not immoral, but it's inappropriate for the pastorate, okay? So, if he continues to sin after he's been confronted, then you take the next step. Them that sin, rebuke before all. So, man, all of a sudden we've gone from, dealing with the deacons, now it's going to be public and all. And the reason for that is if we're going to hold the office of the pastor in high esteem, and we're going to honor that office, and we're going to say, well, he's a man of the word and the doctrine, and he's worthy of double honor. But should he fail spiritually to respond biblically to this matter of rebuke, or the matter of being addressed, his sin being addressed, then it should be rebuke before all. Now, there's many reasons for that. One is, obviously, we gotten to the point that he should not be pastor. He should be put out, all right? Now, it doesn't mean that he's put out of the church because he's not necessarily done anything immoral, but that he no longer carries the qualification of being a blameless pastor. It doesn't mean perfect, but blameless. He's dealing with sin as sin arises. Now, the reason he's rebuked before all is that if you don't, as a church, address the sin publicly, then you're going to end up with divisions. And when you end up with the divisions, you're going to end up in a church split. And so, a church or deacons or someone that could say, well, we don't want to taint his reputation. We don't want to hurt him. We don't want to hurt his wife. So then you have to say, well, what is our priority? Is our priority the testimony of Christ, or is our priority the pastor's testimony? Which of those is most important? And the most important is going to be the holiness of Christ, the testimony of Christ. Well, somebody will say, well, it'll hurt the reputation of the church. Well, then you go back and say again, what's most important? Is it the testimony of Christ, or is it the reputation of Hillsdale Baptist Church? What's the most important? And the answer has to be, the most important thing is the testimony of Jesus Christ. Now, let me finish. If you don't address the sin publicly, then it allows rumors and ultimately division. Even more so, he can leave that church and go to another church. And then in 3 or 4 or 5 years, the same thing is happening at that church that was happening at the former church. Why? Because the former church did not take the biblical responsibility of addressing the sin before all. Now, finally, that others also may fear. Well, you've got the fear in the body, because if you're going to address a sin in a man's life, you better be willing to address the sin in your own life. Judge not, right? Matthew chapter 7. So we understand we have to have judgment, but we also need to judge ourselves as harshly, if you would, as we would judge somebody else. And so in addressing the sin publicly, you deal not only with that pastor and you protect the church, which is going to be the priority, putting Christ first, but you also keep him from going somewhere else, telling his own story of what happened, and then you as a church can say, no, it's public record. This is what happened. Sadly, many churches today don't call for references, and so they'll put a pastor in the pulpit without following up on references. And then sometimes the churches are dishonest and they don't tell you that he was dismissed. And so the failure to act biblically has just a terrible domino effect of destroying churches. And of course, a pattern of sin will be taken somewhere else and it'll start all over again. Yeah, Steve?
So, in this, because this is easy to misinterpret for people. So if I say, I've gone to the pastor, I've taken witnesses, and it says rebuke him before all, so I'm going to stand up in the middle of the service and rebuke him before all.
Right. That's the deacon's role at that point.
Because people interpret it that way.
Yeah.
And we've had it happen here, whatever.
Yeah.
So it's, what's the proper way to do that?
It would be that the deacons would have addressed it. And that's where it stops. And then they take it in front of the church.
So those witnesses that you bring are deacons, and when they see what's going on, then they can say, this is not right, we're going to have to, we're addressing it in front of the church. I'm just,
No.
I know these things, I'm just asking. Because
I know. You're absolutely right. A few years ago, when we dealt with the situation here, I was blessed to have United Deacons. But what happened in public should have never happened. He should have been silenced before. Why? Because the deacons had already dealt with him. And so he should have never been in public. He should have never been allowed in the building. That's true. If I had sinned, then the deacons at that time would have been the ones bringing me in front of the church. So in that point, my point is, I personally as a pastor was violated that Sunday morning. And I had to sit there. And that was wrong. And most of you knew it was wrong. Anyway, this is uncomfortable, huh? And sadly, you've been a deacon, so you've experienced some of this.
And I've lived through a lot of it, and it's not fun.
No.
But being a deacon for many, many years, we neglect to teach deacons that they are the gatekeepers.
I agree.
And it's serious.
Right.
Like you say, if somebody wasn't even supposed to be here, that should have been confronted because they knew why he showed up.
Right. Well, and at that time, in all fairness, our chairman of the deacons was older and weaker, and he was overwhelmed. We had a good process in place, but he was so desirous to fix it, that the problem that that Sunday it was supposed to have been a younger deacon that was going to step up and take the leadership. And did I get that right? Could you agree at that point? Yeah. It was uncomfortable. Yeah, Jim?
So what would be the process, kind of following what Steve was saying? So if this individual allowed into the church, who would have communicated to who regarding stopping him, and who would have stopped him, and how would they have gone
It would
about
have been the deacons. It would have been the deacons.
So the deacons, not the safety team, should have stopped him.
But the deacons would have to be the ones taking the
For the
authority.
police.
The safety team might not even know about it.
Right. But the deacons could handle that. And again, I'm not throwing any ball because
It's hard to do.
I'm preparing for the future, okay? Yeah.
Well, and I appreciate that, Paul, under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, is balancing verse 19 with verse 20.
Right.
Because going off of what Steve said earlier, I've heard some pastors that were in a moral problem saying, there aren't 3 witnesses, so you can't do anything to me. And I'm like, no, that's not how this works.
No, right.
And it was the...
Witnesses of the adultery rather than,
Yeah. So, frankly, one of the churches that we attended in the past dealt with this 30 years ago, and they basically said, oh no, this is not how this works. We've confirmed this with multiple witnesses, you know,
Sure,
the details have been confirmed, and they voted him out, and he, out the door, he was saying, you can't do this to me because there weren't three witnesses of the wrongdoing.
Yeah.
And it's, no, that's not.
Right. Well, and again, that's the twist in the scripture. But sadly, I know of instances where the preachers turned around and sued the church.
Yep.
And but the key even with that is, as a church, even if you're being threatened with a lawsuit, the church has still got to do the right thing.
Well, this is why.
And they call NCLL.
This is why it's so important to, over the past few years, like we've made changes to the Constitution, things like that, where it clarifies steps. And then if you're bringing in a pastor, you ask, like, what is your belief on this?
I'm going to deal with that in a moment
Yeah,
here.
so it's, those things ahead of time. And if you bring in someone that's candidated and they say, yeah, to catch me, you got to have 3 witnesses of me doing it.
Sure.
And I'm pretty sneaky, so
Yeah.
I'm good to go.
Well, and that's part of the reason to doing what we're doing here tonight, really, is that you have to take the leadership. There has to be benevolent love, and yet there's got to be a passion for righteousness. You have to address those things in a good and biblical fashion. And I'm a firm believer even. And there's other things I could share with you, and they would be too personal in here. But don't assume that you know somebody just because they come and they have a silver tongue. You may not know them at all. You may not know their background. You may not have known what they've done. You may not have known the situation in which they left their church. I look across America right now. We have lost many solid Bible fundamental churches. We have lost many of them to this type of wrong, where the church is taken the wrong way. And typically they're going to end up with a young pastor, and he's taking time, he's biding his time, and then slowly he begins to erode the ministry, the integrity of the ministry. The same thing has happened in our Bible colleges. It happened across the way at Clearwater Christian College. And it's happening in other schools, even right now while I'm in front of you. They erode the integrity of the institution. And as a direct result of that, they end up taking enough time to have a board, they replace the board, and then they have a board that falls in line with them. And we've lost good ministries as a result of that. Let me move on because I know I need to finish this. The charge to a young pastor. Can I go a little bit later tonight? I know it's 7:30 is the deacons meeting. Let me give you this here. Some things on this. Pastors should remain aware of the constant presence of God, Christ, and the elect angels. So as a pastor, I'm very much aware that the master, the teachers, will receive the greater judgment. I very much, this is a constant reminder for me. And so let me read this to you. I charge thee before God, before God, the Lord Jesus Christ, and the elect angels. We could debate, are those the heavenly angels or those heavenly witnesses, Hebrews chapter 12, but I'm not going to just the fact that there are 3 that are watching in judgment. That thou observe these things without preferring one before another, doing nothing by partiality. Now, with that said, let me move to this and give you some thoughts to go with that. The first is this: pastors must remain unbiased and impartial. Now, what we're talking about here would be ordination, okay, of ordaining or calling a pastor, a man to be pastor. And so we have this quality here. Pastors must remain unbiased and impartial. So when we put our hands on a young man to ordain him, or as deacons, you call a man to be a pastor, you should do so in the understanding that there are 3 witnesses to your decision. There's God, the Father, there is the Lord Jesus Christ, and there are the elect angels. We could debate what that means, but essentially this: there are 3 that are watching over your decision. So it can't be a choice to call a pastor or ordain a man to be a pastor cannot be taken lightly. It's a serious matter. Then moving on with that, verse 21 then, observe, literally guard or watch or keep these things without preferring one another, without prejudice, without judging, without passing judgment. Now what does that mean? It's not saying that we cannot judge, but it means that we use the same judgment. You know, whether it's a son of a famous pastor or whatever it might be, you know, whatever it might be, you got to have the same judgment. It can't be partiality. Now, what you can end up with in a church, well, I'll use here, for instance, when I was called to be the youth pastor, there were 2 men that had already been considered to be called as the youth pastor. Frank and Jean would know this well. And the church was divided over which of those 2 men, because they were both family men. They were men that grew up at Hillsdale. And so they had this division of families. But my understanding was that Pastor Bradshaw got up and he said, none of them are going to be considered. I'm going to go outside of Hillsdale to find a youth pastor. I'm not going to look here. This would have been after Darla's dad left here. And so I'm offered a free vacation to Florida. That's how I ended up down here, you know, Bradshaw. 40 years later, I'm still here. Anyway, and so I came in and he says, listen, I got your name from Dr. Rupp at Bob Jones, and I want you to come to Hillsdale. I want you to come. And I said, you don't even know me. He said, but I know your reputation. And so anyway, long story short, Pastor Bradshaw had to make the decision to be impartial. That's my point. He could have been partial as to his son-in-law, I believe, or to another family member. He could have been very partial, and he chose instead, now I'm going to dismiss that. Now, I don't know if this verse was the motivation, but it was the application that he used. Now, moving on, pastors then should exercise caution. I want to catch up with my notes. I know I'm almost out of time. Let me give you 3 ways that you exercise caution. All right, here's the first. We should be slow to ordain men into the ministry. There's this thought sometimes you get out of college, you get out of seminary, and then you ordain. We have that in our Constitution here, and as I've thought about it, I think 2 years is the timeline, or is it 1 year? Yeah. Either way, I think the issue cannot be chronological time. It has to be maturity. I think that's what the church, and I don't know how you put that in the Constitution, but it should be spiritual maturity that you're looking for, not has he been here a year or 2 years. Some men might be able to be ordained for the ministry at 25 years old. Another one should be ordained until he's 40 years old. I don't know, but that's another discussion. Impartial, we've already discussed that. By the way, slow to ordain, not a novice. Remember that? 1 Timothy chapter 3, not a novice. All right, and then impartial, and by that again, I'm just going to say charming personality, smooth tongue, whatever it might be. There's got to be an impartial judgment. Number 3, and purity. We sometimes quote this last part, keep thyself pure. And the intent there is pure from what? So let's go back. We're looking at ordaining a man, right? So we're going to go back. Observe these things, preferring one another before doing nothing by partiality. So we're looking at ordaining a man, the kind of man that we're ordaining, and then we see pure. So who is being told in 1 Timothy 5:22, keep thyself pure? Well, Timothy's being told. Timothy is the pastor of the church at Ephesus. So Timothy is being told, before you ordain, lay hands on a man, keep thyself pure. Don't be a partaker of other men's sins. So Timothy, before you ordain a man to be a pastor, you examine the man. And don't put your hands on a man to ordain him until you know that this is a man who is not disqualified because of sins in his life. Timothy, keep yourself pure. Now, we often think about keep yourself pure morally. But what he's really, this is my interpretation, what he's really intending is to say, if you ordain a man who is not spiritually qualified to be in ministry, and he has sins, you now are no longer pure in your own testimony. You're going to be tainted by that man's sins if you ordain an unqualified man to be a pastor. Can I keep going? I know I've got you twisted, your mind's twisting like, what in the world now? All right, moving on. Drink no longer water, but use a little wine. I'm going to get to the young pastor in a moment. But use a little wine for thy stomach's sake and thine often infirmity. So there's a concern for the physical well-being of Timothy here. Whether or not he took a vow of not having wine, I don't know. But certainly it would have been because of stomach issues. So we could presume that maybe drinking water that wasn't good water, and by mixing the wine in with the water, that it killed the bacteria that was in that. We certainly know he's not telling Timothy to go out and get drunk. But there was something about Timothy's physical well-being that he was told to take something for his stomach. So I put this here as a thought. Pastors should be conscious of their physical well-being. And I know I'm not the greatest example of that, but I tried to get out and try to exercise, and I did my walk early this morning. But it's neglecting your health ultimately can shorten your ministry, time of ministry. And I had made a comment a while back. I thought at this age I'm going to be old. Well, I know I'm old, but I don't feel old. And my wife says I have too much energy to live with me 24/7. So, and I do go to my meetings on the board, and those people are old, but they're younger than I am, some of them. So I don't know if any of you feel that way, but anyway, moving on. Some verses on your outline. Not given to wine. Numbers 6:3 shall separate himself from wine and strong drink. So Paul's not saying, drink wine. He's saying take a little wine for your stomach's sake. And again, Romans 12:1 and 2. I know I'm out of time. Let me move on. Here's, I think, the last two things. I have 3 blanks, I believe. Believers must remember that God is the final judge. Some men's sins are open beforehand, going before to judgment. Some men they will follow after. Likewise, also the good works of some are manifest beforehand, and they that are otherwise cannot be hid. So we have two subjects here. In verse 24, the subject is sin. In verse 25, the subject is good works. So two subjects. So here's the first. Some men's sins are open beforehand. Now remembering that God is the final judge regarding sin. So just practically, again, we're still talking in the context of pastors, and particularly here ordaining young pastors. So there are some men's sins that are readily seen, and so they're disqualified. You don't even consider them for a pastor. You get a resume, you look at the resume, and you do a couple of reference calls, and you think, whoa, okay. Why? Because the sins are not beforehand. Well, but we need to fill the pulpit. It doesn't matter what you need to fill. You can't fill the pulpit with somebody who's not qualified. So some sins are not beforehand, going before to judgment. There doesn't need to be a day of judgment. You already know they're disqualified, so you pass over them. And then some men, they follow after. So how do you get to the sins that you don't know about? That's where you go back to the references. You go to the interviews. You are looking through that individual's life for anything that might be a disqualification for him to be a pastor, particularly if he is an experienced pastor. So you call the churches that he's been a part of, and you get references on them before you consider him. So there are some sins that are known beforehand, and they disqualify the man. There are some sins that will be revealed later, and hopefully it's not later when he's in the pulpit. Hopefully it's later in the interview consideration of the man. And then just this note about judging, make sure that as we are judging others, that we ourselves are willing to look at ourselves with that same heightened judgment. Now, manifest beforehand. Let me give you the last one. God is the final judge regarding work. So there's two things that we find here. One was in verse 24, the sins. that might disqualify a man to be a pastor. And then the good works. God is the final judge regarding works. Likewise also, the good works of some are manifest beforehand. In other words, the reputation of the man precedes him. Either you've been in his church, you know him, you have a sense or a confidence of who this man is, what the qualities of this man are. And then the latter part, and they that are otherwise cannot be hid. So there are good works that you will later come to understand, come to know, come to appreciate. Some are very visible, some are not so. And then lastly, therefore, I'm going to give you three thoughts, and I don't have time to cover it. So I don't have time to cover it tonight. But 1 Corinthians 4, verses 1 through 5, talks about ministers, okay? If you have a chance to look at it. Chapter 4, verse 1, pastor should be a servant and a steward of God's word and God's work, all right? Verse 2, a pastor should be faithful, trustworthy to his call. Verses 3 through 5, a pastor should be conscious that the ultimate judge is the Lord. So, a pastor can either have a fear of man or a fear of God. So a pastor cannot preach trying to please the people, because his ultimate judge is not the deacons. The ultimate judge are not the people sitting in the pew. The ultimate judge is God. Therefore, judge nothing before the time until the Lord come, who both will bring to light the hidden things of darkness, and will make manifest the counsels of the heart, and then shall every man have praise of God. Here's what I've learned, and I close. There are some things you will not know. Accept it. You won't know it. Why? Who? What? When? Where? There's some things you're not going to know. But if you are, as a pastor, you have to be mindful of the Lord's coming and his judgment, but you also have to be comforted in this. There are some who have been your enemy, and they have wounded you, but God's going to bring those things to light. The things that are hidden, the counsels, the secret motives, God's going to bring all that to light. There's a greater judge than Hillsdale Baptist Church or the deacons at Hillsdale. There's a greater judge, and that judge is the Lord himself. And then shall every man have praise of God. So in the end, you have to, as a pastor, who am I preaching for? And the ultimate is I'm preaching for the Lord and his words, well done, thou good and faithful servant. All right. I know I've hit a lot tonight.